And well, before we move on to another project, wanted to share with you some of the observations after immersing ourselves for a period of about 6 months in all things that were Lyon. Now, as you know, Stan Gentry's replica of the engine arrived at the Nevada State Railroad Museum in May of, it was in March of 2020. And in May, the museum approached us to do the assessment for about 6 months on the historic Lyon, and then also a similar kind of assessment on the work that Stan and his crew had done on this replica, which they started back in 1988. The report hasn't been published yet. There may be a synopsis of it that we could do, but until then, wanted to share with you all of the images that we were able to find and what we've been able to unearth about its builder. First, the original engine, and then we'll talk just a little briefly about the replica that Stan did that we'll have a chance to see when we get down to the museum tomorrow. Obviously, Peter Donahue and his brothers immigrated from Glasgow, Scotland in 1833. They founded the Union Iron Works in San Francisco in 1849. It was the first iron foundry in Gold Rush, California. In 1856, Peter bought out his two brothers. And in 1860, Donahue hired a very brilliant engineer, a draftsman, and that's Irving M. Scott, and we'll hear that name several times here. And then in 1862, Donahue interested Henry J. Booth, who had a very lucrative partnership in a foundry up in Marysville, to come in to be a partner. And then finally, Donahue retired from the active management of the foundry in March of 1865, and it became primarily H.J. Booth and Company's Union Iron Works at First Street between Market and Mission in San Francisco. And so with a force of about 300 men, Booth and Company built machinery for the mines and the mills of California, as well as the Comstock Lode. In 1865, they ventured out and were building their very first locomotive, and we know that that was the steam locomotive California. It was built for the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad. And between 1865 and 69, H.J. Booth Union Iron Works built 10 standard gauge engines, 440s, 060s, tank engines, and 040s for various clients, including the Sacramento Valley, the Central Pacific, the San Francisco and San Jose, the Cal Pacific, and Black Diamond coal mines at Mount Diablo. This is a wonderful drawing line work that was done by Samuel C. Higgins, who was a young draftsman, aspiring draftsman. The drawing was actually published by G.T. Brown, and this lithograph actually exists in the California State Library. But because of his work, he was hired as an apprentice by H.J. Booth, and later went on to work for Risden Iron and Locomotive Works. And you can see the influence of the drawing. It's clearly what was used as the basis for this illustration, which was in the San Francisco Mining and Scientific Press in 1869. And so this is the first celebrated locomotive of the Union Iron Works. There's quite a bit of documentation, surprisingly, about Union Iron Works, not just reading newspapers, but there's quite a bit in the way of business records, billheads, surviving letters. There's these wonderful catalogs that exist. This is a circular list of patterns, which is in the California State Library in Sacramento. It's a wonderful resource. There are a number of publications like this, actually catalogs of their locomotives that they issued, parts list. And so there's a great body of literature to immerse yourself in if you're going to be starting to work on products of H.J. Booth and the Union Iron Works. The next element in our story here, and if this were a melodrama, many people tend to hiss when I show this photograph, but this, for those of us in this austere group, why this is one of our local heroes, of course, needs little introduction. Enter to the picture Mr. William Sharon. Of course, we know that he started as the agent for the Bank of California in Virginia City in 1864. He was elected in January of 1869 to succeed Thomas Sunderland, so he became the second president of the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. And 3 weeks before the B&T broke ground at Carson City, Sharon inked a deal with H.J. Booth and Company for the first two locomotives, what would be the Lyon and the Ormsby. And it's not unusual that they would have chosen a San Francisco builder. Remember, at this time, the Transcontinental Railroad has not been completed, so it's not that easy to get a locomotive from Baldwin. Many of the early locomotives on the Pacific Coast had to be brought around the tip of South America, longer lead time and a greater expense. And recall also that people like William Ralston, the treasurer for the B&T and also the cashier for the Bank of California, was heavily invested in San Francisco. And anything that was good for San Francisco was good for the Bank of California and therefore good for the B&T. So it's not surprising that they looked to a West Coast builder like Booth to build these first two locomotives. And so we're very fortunate. This is a picture of, or an engraving of William Sharon from the Bancroft Library. And then this is a copy of William Sharon's notes. And we're fortunate to have his notebook. For many years it was up at the University of Nevada. It's now at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. And it's Sharon's notebook of contracts that he entered into. It includes his notes on contracts for with the mining companies for their subsidies, for example. And it includes a multi-page, 2 contracts with the Union Iron Works, including the specifications, the payment arrangements for the Lyon, the Ormsby, and the Story, the first 3 engines of the B&T, and the 3 engines that were built by H.J. Booth. And so there's a good deal of technical information there. And then we're fortunate, the contract was entered into, and we know that the work was fairly well along by May of 1869, and there's this wonderful description of a parade. You know, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, we all thought it was going to occur on May 8th of 1869, but this was the first time in history that a train was ever late. And as we know, the Gold Spike with Leland Stanford didn't make it there until May 10th. So for many communities like Sacramento or San Francisco, not to be outdone, did they delay the party? No, they just celebrated for 3 days. They made it last. And so this is a description of the parade in San Francisco. On May the 8th, H.J. Booth was the Grand Marshal for the 8th Division of the parade, put on by the iron foundries of the city of San Francisco. And it was described in the Daily Alta California as follows, quote, "The men were strong and stalwart and well spoke for the branch of industry that they belonged to. First came the men of the Union Iron Works, numbering 250, all in white capes, and the words Union Iron Works printed on their back. The works spared no expense to make a splendid display, marshaled by Irving M. Scott, their chief draftsman. From the corner of Montgomery and Bush Streets, the new and highly finished locomotive Calistoga was drawn on a truck by 20 grays. This locomotive, which is built entirely of California mahogany with brass fittings and laurel wood cab, weighs 20 tons and was built for the Napa Valley Railroad. It was decorated most profusely with flowers and attracted great attention. Following this was another truck drawn by 4 horses containing the large boiler for the first locomotive to be built for the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. That must have been quite an exhibit and quite a fair and quite a parade to have seen. The locomotive arrives at Reno, and the Reno Crescent tells us the tenders are lettered V and TRR. Number 1 arrives at Reno, and the Mining and Scientific Press tells us that the first 3 engines are going to be number 1 Lyon, 2 Ormsby, 3 Story, that they're arranged in alphabetical order for the first 3 counties which the B&T ran through. And ironically, number 1, the Lyon County pledged $75,000, but the money was never appropriated to the B&T because the county had a fairly impractical route for the railroad. And so while it was their prize engine, was number 1 for many events on the B&T, Lyon was not the most favorite county as far as the B&T was concerned. They did receive subsidies in terms of bonds from both Ormsby and Story County. And so Lyon was the first engine placed on B&T tracks by the U.S. Mint on Caroline Street in Carson City on September 28th. It was off the tracks within 6 weeks of that, one of many times, probably almost weekly, that it's off the rails, primarily due to the lightweight iron rails from England. and the fact for the first couple of years that most of the railroad is not well ballasted. So derailments are pretty frequent. There's a lot of switching accidents, and a lot of it is just plain human error rather than machinery malfunctions. So Lyon was used in construction. It was the first engine across the Crown Point Trestle in Gold Hill on May 12th of 1869. It was the first engine to pull ore from the Yellow Jacket mine down to the Morgan Mill. It was the first engine who brought dignitaries down the Silver City branch when it was completed in March of 1870. And it started entering regular service, mixed train service and passenger service on the 3 trains a day between Carson City and Gold Hill. And then the trains went on to the station, well, it was a station platform, which was up by the Roundhouse in Virginia City. The earliest, there are thousands of surviving train orders, and the earliest one that we found in print is this first written train order, June 28th of 1870, which shows the Lyon was operating out of Virginia City, and it had the schedule to be one of the last trains on the railroad. It would run light, or what they would call wild, off of the time car, run down to Silver City and take the day's ore cars, loaded ore cars, down to the Silver Switch where it would lead them, and then bring back the empties to Virginia City. And here's a list of the locomotives on the railroad as of July 1st, 1870. You can see by this time they actually have 6 locomotives. The Lyon and the Ormsby are 2 smaller engines with 40-inch diameter drivers, whereas the Story is more a road engine with 48-inch diameter drivers, a little bit bigger. If we often think of this as being the first railfan image of the B&T, we looked at all of the existing photographs that we could find that were taken while the engine was still operating, which is basically 1869 to 1875. And this is probably the earliest railfan image that exists of the B&T, if you will. This is A.J. Beale's view of the burnt Gold Hill district after the fire of July 5th, 1870. Beale operated a photography gallery. He was also a pharmacist, druggist in Gold Hill, and here's the whole picture. And if you look right here, you can see a locomotive, and these are some of the Risdon iron ore cars, and it's obvious to us that these are the first batch because they have the large 33-inch diameter wheels as opposed to the smaller size that they were changed out to fairly shortly after that. We studied and studied this and concluded, unfortunately, that it's the profile of one of the B&T's 3 Baldwin 260s rather than one of the Union Iron Works locomotives. And so for its first year, it's primarily working out of Virginia City. It backs up, it does absolutely everything that's needed when the Ormsby breaks down with the gravel train or one of the other engines in passenger or mixed service. It gets thrown out on the main line. It continues running the nightly ore cars down to Silver City. It leaves them at Silver Switch, where they're then dropped during the day by gravity down to the end of the branch line. It leaves the ore cars at Silver City, backs down the Silver City branch to pick up the empties when it makes its daily trip down there, brings these empty ore cars back to Virginia City. Originally, of course, the railroad terminated down here by the Roundhouse. This is where the locomotive spent its nighttime after it tied up. And then, of course, later we extend up into, more properly into downtown Virginia City. There's one more view that shows up. This is in 1871, and this is a good candidate for being the Lyon or the Ormsby. During this time, while the Story has been dismantled and has been reassembled for use on the Reno division to build a new line from Reno down to Carson City. And we think this is probably the earliest known view of either the Lyon or the Ormsby. We've studied the silhouette in great detail, and it's unmistakably either the one or the two. This is part of a large panorama. It's one of 3 views that's taken from the cupola of the Nevada State Capitol. And this particular view looks up north Carson Street, and you can see here at Caroline Street, here's the U.S. Mint. This was the original terminus for the B&T. The original line came down Caroline Street. There was a freight platform on the north side of the Mint, and then the trains actually departed from a platform right here, And you can see the silhouette. Here's a detail. You can see the silhouette of the locomotive there, a big pile of wood. And this is the telegraph office and ticket office that was located right there where the trains took off from. And we see in this area just immediately north up on Washington Street, it was still another year before the tracks were extended down Washington Street, and this area is developed as the passenger station and general office. So here is our first view, or it really is just a silhouette of either the Lyon or the Ormsby. In 1872, of course, the B&T completes the line to Carson City. The story is now back connected with the railroad. Grand celebrations, the great work finished, the Jubilee today. Carson City connected with San Francisco and New York by rail. The first through train, reception by citizens of the city. But still, occasionally the Lyon gets out and helps with some of the ballast work, but largely it stays between Virginia City and Carson City, and primarily it's in the Virginia City area. We have a great many monthly statements of repairs. It's repaired pretty regularly in Virginia City as well as Carson City. Here's a statement of oil consumption, and at this time, this is December of 1872, usually 2 engines are in the shops at one time, and you can see during this month, without any use of oil, clearly it's the Story and the Washoe. But the Lyon is consuming oil products, so we know therefore that it's in regular service during this month. Let's see, we're up to 11 engines at this point, plus we have the Ralston and the Sharon. Those become the Aurora and the Ophir, and the Genoa has not yet arrived. And then we have these two, the Bluebird and the Bald Eagle. Those are 2 engines that the B&T is renting from the Central Pacific. So that's the entire roster at that particular time. In 1873, H.J. Booth writes to Yarrington, says he's going to come visit for a while, and Booth says that H.J. Booth has 2 extra sets of new steel tires that would fit the 48-inch diameter drivers on the Story. So he offers them to the B&T fairly cheap. The B&T buys those, and when the Story comes in for rebuilding, just a couple months later, they put new tires on them at that time. And then the second set goes on them, apparently, when the locomotive is sold up in Canada. So that keeps the Story running for quite a number of years. Apparently, the 40-inch diameter tires on the Lyon and the Ormsby were never turned, and that's one of the limiting things. The boiler lasts for decades, but the running gear on those locomotives seems to be what actually wears out. The next image that we found is this marvelous pre-fire view. This is a large panorama, and through the wonders of what we could do now with scanners, you can start to zero in. This is a pre-fire view, and it was taken by E. Hurd in 1874, and this was used as the basis for Augustus Couch's bird's eye view in Virginia City. And in this detail up here, and I've blown it up here, you can see this is the curved train shed, and in the front is the silhouette of the locomotive, but still we don't learn very much from that. There's another one just shortly after that. This is another Noe and Hurd photograph, which was a photograph that says existed, and they used the photo as the basis for this drawing, which is in DeQuille's History of the Big Bonanza. And so the photograph was taken in the mid-1875, and the illustration appears in Big Bonanza, which was published in 1876. The engine, poor old Lyon, has had one major rebuild in the course of its 5 years up to this point. And this is a rebuild which occurs in 1873. And we're told that from April to June of 1873 that the Lyon is in the Virginia City Roundhouse, where it is completely rebuilt. We know that the master mechanic at that time, Bill Bowker, is also the foreman at Fulton Foundry. The B&T does not have any foundry, any casting capability of its own at Virginia City, and they don't get it down in Carson City until 1875. So they're using any parts that would have been cast for the engine would have had to have been made at the nearby Fulton Foundry. They have light touch-up painting capabilities, certainly at the car shops and the engine house, but the newspaper tells us that when the engine is completely rebuilt, that it then goes down to Carson City, where it's going to be painted in the paint shops down in Carson City. The poor old engine is getting tired, and in December of 1874, we learned that the smokestack gets knocked off at one of the ore dumps of the Con, Virginia, and the editor of the Virginia Evening Chronicle comments that the Lyon was constantly getting out of repair. The repair bills every single month. There are some repairs that need to be performed on the locomotive, constantly getting off of the track. And finally, they note that Yarrington has ordered a replacement switch engine for the Lyon, and that's going to be the locomotive J.W. Bowker, which is going to replace the poor little Lyon locomotive. That's the switch engine at Virginia City. So the J.W. Bowker arrives in April of 1875. The Lyon goes down to Carson City. It has a little bit of use in the Carson yards for a couple months, and the last month it's in service at all is in July of 1875. So 6 years worth of fairly constant use, and we're talking 7 days a week. And then it's stored in the West Carson Engine House in Carson City. The Ormsby, its mate, has a similar fate. It is stored. However, just within a couple of months of its retirement, we know that Matthew Culberson Gardner gets a contract from H.M. Yarrington and D.L. Bliss to do some major lumbering operation over at Lake Tahoe. And Gardner prevails on Yarrington to lease the Ormsby, and so we have these two images of it over on Gardner's Railroad at Lake Tahoe from 1875 through 1879. Unfortunately, Gardner reneged and forfeited the engine effective August 13th of 1880. And the spring of 1881, the V&T repossessed the locomotive and returned it to Carson City. The boiler was still the strong and the best part of that engine, and so from October of 83 till October of 1903, a period of 20 years, the boiler for the Ormsby became the stationary shop boiler inside the V&T's Carson City engine house. So it's a real testament to the fine boiler work done by H.J. Booth's Union Iron Works. In 1903, they needed to replace the boiler, so they put in a modern oil-fired boiler from Pennsylvania. We know a year later that the Ormsby's boiler was sold for scrap to Jardine Machinery Company down in San Francisco. They sold it for $100 FOB on a car at Carson City. So it lasted for quite a little while. And then, of course, the other H.J. Booth engine, the Story, we looked at these, all three of the Booth products. The Story started to get some notoriety in 1871 when this illustration was published in London Engineering. And this is not exactly how the engine looked, but what we deduced from this, it is probably Irving Scott's design drawing or engineering drawing for the engine, probably before it was actually built. And this, he probably sent a set of these to London Engineering, and the magazine. This is a 2-page spread in London Engineering. They also included a page of specifications, and there's a couple of other cross sections which are quite valuable as well. They not only did this locomotive, but they followed up within the next couple of months and did a couple of other H.J. Booth engines, and these are wonderful documentation as well. We know that this, the Story was used out on the road, and it also had a major rebuild. The Carson shops were coming along, and the engine was moved into the Carson shops for a major overhaul in April of 1875. This is a big crescendo that's going on during the big bonanza at this time. It took quite a while. The work was actually delayed because we had the big Virginia City fire in October of 1875 and other priorities. So the engine wasn't turned out until April of 1876. So it was in the shops, off the roster, if you will, the active roster, for a full year. And so we think this stereo on the left was probably taken at Gold Hill. It's a primitive stereo. It clearly dates before the work of Watkins in 78, 79. So our feeling is that probably the stereo dates from shortly after that rebuild, which would put it mid-76 or 77. And clearly it's got an entirely rebuilt cab. It's got a Baldwin-style tender. We're very fortunate to find this wonderful pattern for replacement cab parts. This is a cab race, which is at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. Here's a picture of it in Wendell's office. And they knew which engine it was, even if they just spelled it S-T-O-R-Y. It's for the story. And there's the left side cab race, a wonderful artifact that probably dates to the time of that rebuilding. As we know, why the B&T was building towards that great crescendo, they never had enough moving powder, never had enough locomotives, never had enough cars, until the crescendo came, and that was June of 1876. And then all of a sudden, we had more equipment than they knew what to do with. With every boom, there is a bust, and it started to go downhill fairly quickly. And within 2 years, Yarrington would sell off 8 B&T locomotives. And so, as we know, why the story was sold up to Canada, the B&T took it in the shops and did this wonderful paint job on it, painting it very much in a kind of a Baldwin style one paint scheme. And this is what it was looked like when it was up in Canada as Canadian Pacific Railway No. 1 to Yale. And this is what it was, a product of the B&T paint shop, so it was sent out looking this way. As we mentioned, why the B&T did not have in-house casting capability until July of 1875 down in Carson City. And so there are surviving orders for many, many parts when they needed Baldwin trucks, or they needed drivers, or they needed cylinders, or even entire cylinder saddles, rather than cast them in full foundry, which is already very busy doing work for the local mines. They just ordered extra parts, if you will, from the builders. And we think they probably ordered a couple of extra tenders as well. But it's obvious in the records when the locomotives come in for repair that the master mechanic, when he wants to test fire them, they don't always bring in the tender with the engine. So clearly he had an extra tender kicking around, and indeed one of the Peterson photos in 1882 shows an extra tender in front of the engine house. And we see that Baldwin-style tenders show up on a couple of the engines, including the Story, and Baldwin tank shows up possibly on the Dayton as well. So we've yet to find all those extra order records in B&T documentation, which can be a bit spotty, or in Baldwin extra order records, but certainly the physical evidence suggests that. And so picking back up here again, our story on the Lyon, now that we know what happened to its sisters, the Ormsby and the Story. The Lyon is stored inside the West Carson engine house until a new timetable is issued in 1887. And then Yarrington has extra passenger cars he needs to store someplace. And so on May 22nd of 1887, the appeal says the Lyon and remnants of the Ormsby. And the remnants now, consider that the boiler has been removed, so you're just looking at the tender as well as the engine frame and the running gear. All of this has been moved out from the roundhouse and has been moved out to the boneyard where the Ormsby remains are being cut up. And enter into this picture this young lad, 22-year-old Henry Elliott, who's an aspiring amateur photographer. We know that he lived on 3rd Street, which is very close to the shops, and he had several of his neighbors and friends worked in the B&T shops. And apparently he took a liking to the Lyon, because whenever significant things happen to the locomotive, he just happens to be over there, thank goodness for us, and to take a picture. And so here's a picture that corresponds to the newspaper article. This is probably taken during the winter of '87 or possibly '88, of the boneyard with the remnants of the Ormsby, and that's in front here. This is a detail from this larger view here. And these are all parts from the Ormsby, and many of us have spent hundreds of hours looking at these parts, turning the picture upside down. We pretty well have most of them cataloged, and we can tell you what those are. These are all parts from the Ormsby. And the Lyon stays fairly much intact as an engine, still the ability to roll it around. But this is a good view. Consider that the locomotive has been rebuilt once and repainted once in its 6 years of operation. It's been just pushed inside the engine house, and this is the first time it's come out and is seeing daylight in over 10 years. So we're looking here at its possible configuration and painting style that it would have had when it was last in service in 1875. The next view that we have from Elliott and his several hundred glass plates, that collection have all been donated to the Nevada Historical Society, and we're still finding wonderful jewels in it, is this view of the Carson engine house. And we're able to determine that this is the tender from Carson, Colorado, number 4. And by going through the shop records, this is not on the engine transfer car, but it's on a car that later became the tender transfer car for the B&T. We have dated this between September and November of 1888, which coincides very well with that previous photo. And looking over here, we can see that the Ormsby is gone, but we're still seeing the Lyon sitting intact over here in the boneyard. The next image we have from Elliott is of number 1 and probably the best early view we have, which we've dated as July 11th, 1889. And the reason for that is that Archie Farrington operated the Reno Smelling Mill and Reduction Works up in Reno, and he was a good friend of Yerington. He was involved with Yerington's Union Mine down in Cerro Gordo. And when Farrington needed a standby boiler for a while, he prevailed. The boiler would be his boiler would be repaired by the B&T shops in Carson City. Prevailed upon Yerington to loan him a stationary boiler. And so we know from B&T shop records, which we have, that the engine was taken into the shops. Here you see they've taken the rods down. They've prepared it for stationary boiler service. The crosshead is off. We've got an injector back in the cab, and it's plumbed here and just about ready to go out to Reno, where it's going to be used for a couple months in stationary boiler service. And Henry Elliott would have lived about 3 blocks away from where this picture was taken, just as the engine's getting ready to go to Reno. And then leave it to another photographer, very fortunately. This is a Carson City photographer, Charles H. Peters, who took this cabinet card. And many of us recall seeing this in B.B. and Clegg's When Beauty Rode the Rails. Mike Collins and I drove from Sacramento up to Virginia City to meet with Charles Clegg's sister, and we picked up the B.B. and Clegg photo collection for the California State Railroad Museum. And sandwiched in those 50 boxes was this original cabinet card. B.B. would have gotten it probably from Graham Hardy, who got it from B&T Files. But it shows the number 1 at the Reno Reduction Works, and we know from B&T records it was up there July 11th through September 13th of 1889 in stationary boiler service, and we can see the plumbing going into the building there. So, you know, the boiler, well, the running gear is pretty tired. There's no side rods on it. It's not an operating locomotive. The boiler is still very good, and it made sense to keep it around. When it came back to Carson City, there's no room for it in the West Carson engine house, but we do want to keep it around because it's a good boiler, so it gets parked down on Stewart Street. Stewart Street's a pretty busy street going down to the wood yards. B&T crews are going back and forth. It's like parking the ore cars in Virginia City down by the roundhouse where the crews can keep an eye on them. So it's some have mused that it was for the enjoyment of the kids down at the state orphan home. That's not impossible. Yerington did a lot for the orphans. I was very fond of them, supported their causes financially. But it also was a good place to park it and still keep an eye on it and keep it around as a potential stationary boiler use. Clearly they knew the boiler on the Ormsby was good. They were using it in the shop. If they needed another backup boiler for a temporary basis someplace else, or for the shop, I think this would have been a good candidate. So it got saved, it got kept around. So here, a number of views. This one is attributed to George D. Oliver. He dates this as July 10th, 1893, down by the State Orphans Home in South Carson, just below Fifth. The original State Orphans Home, the big wood building, 2-story wood dormitory, was built in 1870, and it burned down in July of 1902. This next item is I put in because it just shows how you have to be careful of newspapers, and because it's written in black and white in a newspaper doesn't make it the gospel. We need to be careful. And so here's out of the Pioche record. June 22nd, 1899, it says the locomotive Lyon, the first engine owned by the Virginia Truckee Railroad Company, is being refitted and changed to a narrow gauge to do duty in the Carson and Colorado yard at Keeler, Nevada. well, it's actually Keeler, California. Well, only about half of that is true. What happened is that part of the B&T empire is what's known as the Inyo Development Company down at Keeler. And in mid-1899, when the Inyo Development Company's old boiler needed repair, Yarrington wrote Mills that he would be sending down, quote, an old locomotive boiler in A1 condition. And then we have this wonderful letterpress copy that Brian Norton first brought to our attention to the Inyo County assessor, in which the assessor, he writes to the assessor and says, "'Tis true that we have during the past year put in considerable machinery, an engine, a boiler, a crusher, a conveyor, etc., but not at the heavy expense you imagine, i.e. being second-handed. The boiler only cost $750. It was taken out of the first locomotive built for the Virginia and Truckee Railroad Company over 30 years ago." And so, and we have shop records that we found that confirm that. They removed the boiler for the Lyon from its frame, prepped it, sent it down to the Inyo Development Company, where it was used in stationary boiler service, and at the Inyo Development Company down at Keeler. This is a picture of Yarrington and Laws down at the ID Company in February of 1902. We don't know the details of when, where, and how long it lasted. We know that Inyo Development was sold to the Natural Soda Works. 1924 was leased and then later sold. Natural Soda Works went bankrupt in 27. They were reorganized, sold, the operation was moved south. They finally ceased operation in 1952 and the plant was dismantled, but we suspect by that time that the Lyon had probably made its final roar. But you know, when you consider that the Ormsby's boiler lasted for 20 years in stationary boiler service, it's not unreasonable to think that, you know, the Lyon might have lasted another 10 or 20 years in stationary boiler service down at Keeler. So with that, and these are just the highlights of what is a over 100-page report on the detailed history of the Lyon. We next looked at the work that Stan Gentry and his crew had done. We were very impressed with the quality of the workmanship and the materials which they used in their replica. This was a labor of love which Stan began in 1988 in Iowa, and obviously he's been here a couple of times, and many of us have been involved in that project in various capacities off and on over several years. As funding became tight and as it approached 80% completion, he had always hoped that the engine would come out to Nevada, and timing was everything, and so he presented the engine to the Nevada State Railroad Museum at about its 80% completion. The objective in his work has always been to make an unoperable replica, and so the original engine was had a crown bore bar firebox, so a boiler, so he put it that way. Where every place it's going to show, if it was riveted, they made it riveted, or simulated those, even though in protected areas like under the jacket while the boiler is welded. So they made it equal to, if not better, if they could, to make it a very dependable and reliable operable locomotive, and as accurately as they could. They also, like many operating replicas, built in a number of features, particularly in the tender, that would make it more easily operable. And for example, in the tank, and we'll have a chance to see a lot of this work when we go down to the museum on Sunday. For example, they put in a sight glass on the side of the tender tank, so you'd know how much water you had in the tank. What a nice convenience, you know. They knew it needed to have crosshead pumps up front. It always had crosshead pumps. It never had injectors while it was in service on the B&T. But to make it a more reliable and easily operated engine and a safer engine, they were planning to put in a couple of Penberthy injectors and actually conceal them within the tender. The engine itself never had any brakes while it was operable on the B&T, never had an air pump. But they devised a way to conceal an air pump and actually put tender brakes to make it safer to operate the engine. So there were a number of modern safety appliances that just would add it to its reliability and to its safety that they envisioned right from day one in order to make it a more dependable and more easily operable replica. And so we saw nothing that mechanically during visual inspection that would preclude reoperation of the engine. That we know that they successfully hydroed the locomotive back in Iowa, although it has never been test fired. And so the bottom line, in just very summary fashion, our recommendations were appoint a project manager to identify and assemble all the disparate parts, drawings, the raw materials, the patterns, which are scattered all over the country right now from here to Iowa, also in a shop in Burbank, California, and bring all those parts and materials, a great deal of engineering that Stan and his crew have already done, a number of patterns for all their work, and finally get it all on site here in Carson City. That's a logical first step to get somebody appointed to bring all that stuff together. 2 would be to conduct a detailed mechanical inspection and to road test the locomotive. Somebody needs to build a fire in it and see, does the darn thing actually steam? Will it move under its own power? Do a basic assessment for reoperation. Very often, you know, there's a reason they discarded some of these old engines, and that's because they don't work very well. Well, how well does this replica work? Can it be, is it worth putting the money into it to finish it so that it can move and get out of its own way? Could it even pull something? We know that the museum now has narrow gauge track all around, as well as standard gauge. You know, what's the next project for the museum? Could it be making this a dependable locomotive to use for regular operation on the museum's track? So a basic assessment for reoperation. And then 3, develop a plan, the engineering package, and the rest of the funding needed to complete it. Number 4, either as a static display or to make it a reliable operating replica. We did take a look at the current list with the help of J. David Conrad. He's working on an update of his 2-volume steam locomotive directory of North America. And since his last list, the list has almost doubled in terms of the number of replicas that we have, operating replicas in North America. And so the Lyon is not just a one-off. I mean, there are many dependable operating replicas. Some of these replicas have been around longer than the original locomotive than they're replicating. So there's some real credibility, some lineage, some precedent for using replicas. And as original fossils become scarcer and we are reticent to operate them, well, I think it makes a lot of sense to rely on replicas to help fill in many of the holes that we have in understanding the evolution of technology and things that could be consumed perhaps more so than original artifacts. So here's the Lyon down here. It joins a very distinguished list of replicas in this country dating back to as far as 1892. So that's a broad overview of what we've done. I'm going to ask Mike to come up. Mike spent considerable time developing the drawings, and as you know, in order to, you look at a finished product with one of his drawings and you marvel at it, but what goes into that is thinking in great microscopic detail about 500 components and understanding how it's used, where it's used, the evolution that it goes through, and there's you can appreciate the drawing, and it might take a couple hundred hours to do the drawing. But I'll tell you, it takes thousands of hours beforehand going into those to go through the intellectual process it takes to understand each one of those parts, how they work together in order to come up with some of this fine mechanical drawing. So Michael's going to come up and give you the other half of this program. Michael?
Thank you, Stephen. Bobby at the thing going here.
We're ready.
Ready? Okay. All right, this is the drawing that Stephen showed, and this was done by Union Iron Works, so they have a copy of it at the California State Railroad Museum, along with some other drawings that Union Iron Works did. Note in the drawing, there's no smokestack, no headlight. The cab is a little bit different than what we see on the Lyon itself. So these are the type of things we have to look at. The framing is all there, the drivers are there, just trying to figure out how everything goes together and starting to lay out the drawing. So here's the cab of the Lyon, and you can see that it's completely a different type of cab that's on the Lyon today, or on this photograph anyway, than what was in the drawing. And we have the photograph of the Ormsby, which was over at Lake Tahoe at this time on Gardner's Railroad. And you can tell here that the cab is different. It's got a different arc in the back, and it's got some filigree on the side of the windows here. The difference. The what?
$50 is fine.
Yeah, whoever's phone went off, you go back there and pay $50, Arlene. Headlight over here, you have the headlight, a Williams headlight, and the smokestack here. So it gives us a kind of an idea of what the actual locomotive probably looked like at the time. And we figured that this is probably the original cab on the locomotive at that time. And both the Lyon and the Ormsby were built to the same drawing, same plan. So you got the same basic engines on both. Although Yerington always called the Ormsby a bad engine, not as a good operating engine as the Lyon. Oh, get the wrong button here. All right, here's another photograph, same deal, but you can tell here the filigree on the cab. This is the Ormsby, of course. A guy standing up on the cab roof, and the arch on the rear here. It gives you a little bit better idea of what the cab looks like. All right, let's go back to Union Iron Works. This is the California, which Stephen said was the first locomotive built by Union Iron Works for the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad. You can go back. Okay, you can tell it's kind of a dark photograph. I thought I had another photograph of it in there, but it's got that arch window in it, and the filigree around that, and then of course a good picture of the Williams headlight and the stack. This is the Atlantic, another good photograph. This came out of the book Prune Country Railroads by Norman Holmes, and is a good side view shot. And you can see a good shot of the cab, the smokestack, and the headlight. So that gives us a better idea of what the locomotive would have looked like. This is a Danford Cook and Company locomotive. Where's Wolke? Jim around?
Yeah.
Where are you? What engine is this, Jim? You're the one that gave me that photograph.
That's the Growler.
What railroad?
Central Pacific.
Central Pacific? Okay. And you can tell here on this particular photograph, here's the filigree going around the cab. All right. So basically, the Danford Cook and Company sold locomotives to the San Jose and San Francisco Railroad. So when Union Iron Ore started building their locomotives, they copied a lot of the characteristics off of the Danford Cook locomotives. So that gives us a good idea of what the cabs look like. Also, the V&T had two locomotives built by Danford and Cook, number 15 and number 16, and they basically had the same type of cab on them. So I've gone back and changed my drawings on the 15 and 16 based on this information. So here's what I came up with, the cab, using the information off the California. And also, we have drawings of the California at the California State Library. So basically, used those drawings and then came up with the cab for the Lyon. Smokestack, okay, no smokestack on the drawing, so this is a little bit narrower smokestack than was on than what I came up with, but very similar to what's on the California. So we were able to take that smokestack and use it. And the Williams headlight, Stan had called and wanted a headlight drawing, of a Williams headlight. And at the time, we had the CP Huntington in the shops over in Sacramento. And I was able to go into the shops and measure the headlight off of the CP Huntington, which is a Williams headlight. And we also have it on the Governor Stanford. So we were able to check a couple of things. So I drew up the headlight for Stan for the locomotive. And so I just was able to take that light and use it in the drawing of the Lion. Okay, the tender, no drawing of the tender. There is a drawing of a narrow gauge tender in the collection we have at California State Library, California State Railroad Museum Library, but no tender drawing of the standard gauge tender. But Bob Dockery, who did a lot of these photographs, he would take these photographs and they would take them into his darkroom, reshoot them, and then reprocess them through the darkroom and come up with detailed information that gave us a lot of insight into what the cabs and the tenders and that looked like. So Bob came up with some measurements for that, and he gave those to Stan. And based on the information that I got from Bob Dockery, he gave me a copy of his measurements. I was able to come up with a tender drawing of the Lion. I have not checked this against the actual tender that's over at the Railroad Museum now. But anyway, there's two versions of this. The toolbox is across the back on it. If you see that on the R3 photograph, you'll see the toolbox going across the back of the tender. And then later on the view, you'll see a toolbox here on the back of the tender. So I think all they did, they just put a board across the back of that to add the toolbox to it. And you can see that in some of the photographs that Dockery took. So basically, here's what you have, based on the information that we were able to come up with. The frames and all that is basically off the drawings. Smokestack is off to California, basically. The headlights off of the CP Huntington. The cabs are basically off to California. And then the tender is basically what Dockery had come up with in his research. So putting that all together, this is what I came up with for the drawing of the Lion. And over here on the wall, I think, yeah, one of these drawings over on the wall is that drawing, so you can look at that. Stephen alluded to the number 3 of the story, and the coming out of the Lion, London's Engineering magazine. I started working on a drawing of that actually before I started working on the Lion. And then we got to the point where we said, I better get back on the Lion and start working on this one. But I am working on a drawing of this particular locomotive. And as Stephen noted, it looks like it has a ballroom type tender. It does have the different cab on it. So the V&T we know have rebuilt cabs on several of their locomotives. And we talked about that yesterday on the Reno. It's got more of a Baldwin type or a J.W. Barker stack on it over here. And 48-inch drivers, more like the Empire and the number 4, number 5, Virginia and the Carson, yeah. So here's my rendition of the story that I'm still working on. I promised this to Jim Wilkie about 2 years ago, so maybe next year, Jim, I'll get it to you. So that's about all I have on it. And John, you ready? You want to take a break?
You might have some questions. Let me turn on some lights.
Yeah, any questions? All right, let's go ahead and take a break. You want to go over to the opinion room or the other room to see what's over there? Make sure you go out those doors. Don't go through the pool, okay?
I've got a question. See what you can answer this. Do we know why? What were the specifications that made these boilers so good?
They built ships too, you know. So
Yes.
that's that boiler.
Battleships.
Yeah, so that's probably why they were good.
They built the battleships when they built these.
Yeah. Now, I don't know about that, but I know it's a ship, yeah.
All right, we got another question.
Would they steal or all out?
Like steel, we think, let's go back and look at it.
Good workmanship, rivets close together, just good quality boilers, well built.
Another question over here.
Are there any original parts that would go to that #1 Lion?
No.
Is that right? Nothing.
There's paperwork,
Not
yeah, that goes back to
even a
1870.
nameplate or anything was saved?
Nope.
No, we haven't, was a drawing.
Mike?